Chapter 1: The Call at 4 a.m. The cardboard was soaked through, sagging like wet skin. Rain tapped against the bare branches with the patience of a clock that had nowhere to be. The smell came first: damp earth, old paper, something metallic underneath. A young patrolman gagged, turned his head, and still couldn't escape it. The woods off Susquehanna Road were quiet in that special way places get when they are about to be remembered forever. The flashlight beam trembled as it slid across the box. A box for a bassinet. Mass-produced. Cheap. Once meant to hold something alive. Now it didn't. The call had come at 4 in the morning, sharp and unforgiving, slicing through a half-dream of burnt coffee and unpaid bills. A hunter's voice on the other end of the line. Nervous. Almost apologetic. As if he was sorry for discovering what no one else wanted to find. "There's a kid out here," the men had said. "I think he's dead." Dead was an understatement. Dead was polite. Dead was what you said when you still believed words could soften reality. The boy lay naked, small, his skin pale against the dark leaves. Bruises bloomed across his body like a cruel map. His hair was cut short, uneven, as if done in a hurry or by someone who didn't care about symmetry. His fingernails were clean. Too clean. Someone had taken time with that. That detail would bother them later. For now, all they could think about was the silence. No crying parents. No frantic phone calls flooding the station. No name shouted into the woods. Just rain. And a box. One detective crouched down, the cold seeping through his coat, and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. The flame flickered, briefly illuminating his face, tired eyes, creased skin, a man already worn thin by a city that produced too many bodies and not enough answers. "Jesus," he muttered. Not as a prayer. More like an accusation. The boy looked peaceful in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. No dramatic blood. No theatrical violence. Just the quiet aftermath of something that had gone on for too long behind closed doors. Violence without witnesses. The kind that doesn't scream. Someone pulled a blanket over the body. Another man wrote notes he would later wish he hadn't phrased that way. The box was photographed, measured, tagged like an item in a warehouse. Evidence always looked smaller once it was catalogued. In the distance, a siren wailed and faded, as if even the city didn't want to come any closer. They would later argue about who arrived first, who saw what, who touched the box before the cameras came. Memory has a way of protecting itself. Facts are less loyal. By sunrise, the woods were crawling with uniforms. Reporters hovered at the edges, sniffing for tragedy like sharks with notepads. Someone joked, dark, automatic, about how at least the kid wouldn't have to go to school that day. No one laughed. But no one stopped him either. The boy had no identification. No clothes. No missing persons report waiting to embrace him. He was estimated to be around 4 years old. Malnourished. Beaten. Dead for several days. A professional summary. Clean. Efficient. What it didn't say was this: someone had failed him every single day of his life. The box was sealed and loaded into the back of a van. As the doors slammed shut, a dull finality echoed through the trees. A period at the end of a sentence nobody had finished reading. The detective crushed his cigarette into the mud and stared at the empty space where the body had been. "You know what gets me," he said to no one in particular. Someone packed him up. Took the time. Folded the box. Like manners still mattered. The rain kept falling. And somewhere in the city, people woke up, poured milk over cereal, kissed their children on the forehead, and went on with their lives, unaware that a story had just begun that would never truly end. The boy had been found. But nobody was looking for him yet. And that, in this city, was the most terrifying part of all. Chapter 2: A Question Nobody Wanted. By noon, the story had a headline. Not a name. A shape. A phrase. Something small enough to fit into a column but heavy enough to stain the page. Reporters needed something the public could remember, so they gave the boy a container instead of an identity. Boy found dead in a box. It sounded almost neat. Like a magic trick gone wrong. At the precinct, the air smelled of stale coffee, wet wool, and resignation. Phones rang, stopped, rang again. Detectives leaned over desks cluttered with paper that would soon mean nothing. Someone pinned photographs to a corkboard. Someone else turned away too quickly. The boy lay on a steel table in the morgue, under harsh white lights that offered no mercy. The coroner worked in silence, methodical, professional. He had learned long ago that if you spoke to the dead too often, they started answering back. Estimated age, between 3 and 5. Cause of death, blunt force trauma, compounded by malnutrition and prolonged abuse. Time of death, several days prior. No signs of sexual assault. Multiple healed fractures. He paused at that part. Healed meant time. Time meant repetition. Repetition meant someone had been practicing. The report was factual. It had to be. Facts were safer than emotions. Facts didn't ask questions. But the room still felt crowded with them. Outside, a young officer stared at the vending machine, trying to decide if hunger was appropriate right now. Inside his head, a thought kept circling, irritating and unwelcome. If this kid mattered, wouldn't someone be screaming by now? That was the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Because it led to another one. What if the truth doesn't belong to the victim? The city assumed it did. The newspapers certainly did. Everyone loves a story where innocence points a finger and justice follows like a well-trained dog. But innocence can't testify. And dead children don't make accusations, they make demands. The problem was, no one knew who to demand answers from. By the afternoon, calls started coming in. Anonymous tips. Psychics. A woman who claimed she had dreamed of the box 3 nights earlier. A man who swore he had seen something similar in another state, another year, another life. None of them knew the boy's name. A detective flipped through missing persons reports, his finger tracing faces that looked nothing like the body on the table. Too old. Too well-fed. Too loved. The irony was almost funny, in a way that made his jaw tighten. Maybe he wasn't reported, someone said. Kids don't just disappear, another replied. They both knew that wasn't true. Not in a city with basements. Not in a country that confused privacy with virtue. The boy had clean fingernails. That detail kept coming back. Someone had clipped them carefully, recently. Not a gesture of panic. A gesture of routine. As if abuse and hygiene were not mutually exclusive. That made it worse. It suggested a person who believed they were doing the right thing. Or at least a normal thing. By evening, the case had a task force. Big words. Fresh folders. The comforting illusion of momentum. Photographs were circulated to newspapers with the boy's face partially obscured, as if modesty still applied. The public reacted exactly as expected. Outrage. Sadness. A collective tightening of the chest. Donations promised. Candles lit. Strangers swore they would never forget him. They already had. Because without a name, grief has nothing to hold on to. The detective from the woods stood at the window, watching the city darken. Neon signs flickered to life. Bars filled. Laughter spilled onto sidewalks. Life, undeterred by the inconvenience of death, kept moving. He's not missing, he said quietly. He's misplaced. No one corrected him. The question hung in the room, unspoken but heavy. If no one claims a child, does the truth still matter? And deeper still, more dangerous than any suspect. What if the truth, when found, doesn't make the boy a victim at all, but merely a footnote in someone else's survival? Outside, the first evening edition hit the streets. The box had become famous. The boy inside it remained anonymous. And somewhere, whoever had sealed that cardboard shut was either very afraid. Or sleeping just fine. Chapter 3, The City That Swallowed Children. Philadelphia in the 1950s liked to pretend it was healed. The war was over. The flags were folded away. Men wore hats again, women smiled in advertisements, and every streetcar carried the quiet belief that the worst was behind them. But cities don't heal the way bodies do. They scar. And then they learn to hide it. In North Philadelphia, the houses leaned toward each other like tired conspirators. Paint peeled in polite silence. Basements smelled of coal dust, mold, and secrets that never made it upstairs. Children learned early how to stay quiet, not because someone told them to, but because noise invited attention, and attention was unpredictable. This was a city where kids fell through cracks wide enough to swallow a life. Orphanages overflowed. Foster homes were inspected once, maybe twice, and then forgotten. Records were handwritten, smudged, misfiled. Names slipped. Birth dates changed. A child could arrive as one person and leave as another, or not leave at all. No one called that evil. They called it bureaucracy. The detectives knew this, even if they didn't say it. Every missing face on the board came with a story that sounded the same after a while. Mother sick. Father gone. Aunt couldn't manage. Someone promised to take care of the boy. Someone failed. The boy in the box fit too well into that pattern. Too well to be noticed. The neighborhoods around the woods were questioned first. Doors opened a crack, then wider when badges flashed. People answered politely, cautiously. No one had seen anything. No one had heard crying. No one recognized the photograph. A woman with curlers and a cigarette studied the image for a long moment, then shook her head. Kids come and go, she said. You stop keeping count. She didn't sound cruel. Just practical. In a corner bar not far from the precinct, detectives drank cheap whiskey and talked shop like men trying to convince themselves this was just another case. The jukebox played something cheerful, which felt like an insult. You know what scares me, one of them said. Not that someone killed him. That someone raised him first. They laughed. A short, dry laugh. Black humor was cheaper than therapy. Newspapers ran stories about the city's progress, its shiny future, its proud working families. On the next page, a small column asked if anyone recognized the boy. The contrast was almost artistic. Philadelphia loved its children. Abstractly. In reality, children were currency. Labor. Burden. Proof that you had done your duty. And when duty became inconvenient, the system offered places to put them, institutions with clean names and dirty hallways. Somewhere in that maze, the boy had existed. The detectives traced manufacturers of the box. A local company. Sold in dozens of stores. Thousands of identical containers. A dead end wrapped in cardboard. They traced the blanket. Mass-produced. Common. Sold cheap. Another dead end. Everything about the boy suggested ordinariness. He wasn't hidden because he was special. He was hidden because he wasn't. That was the city's real crime. Late one night, a detective flipped through old case files, eyes burning, fingers blackened with ink. Runaways. Abuse reports. Anonymous calls logged and dismissed. He stopped on one report and stared longer than necessary. A complaint about a child crying in a basement. Filed. Unsubstantiated. Closed. The address was gone. The officer who wrote it had transferred. The paper smelled faintly of mildew. Christ, he whispered, not for the first time. The city had swallowed the boy long before the box ever touched the ground. The woods were just where it spit him back out. Outside, children played stickball under a streetlight. Their laughter echoed between buildings like a challenge. Like proof of something still alive. None of them knew how close they lived to being forgotten. And somewhere, behind a locked door or under a polite roof, the idea of what had been done to that boy sat quietly, waiting to see if anyone was truly paying attention this time. Most of the city wasn't. It was busy surviving. And that, Philadelphia would later realize too late, was exactly how monsters stayed ordinary. Chapter 4, The Boy Without a Name. The morgue never slept, but it never felt awake either. The fluorescent lights hummed like tired insects. Stainless steel reflected everything and remembered nothing. The boy lay still on the table, smaller than everyone expected, as if death had continued to take things from him even after it was done. The report read like a checklist of quiet horrors. Multiple bruises in various stages of healing. Scars that did not belong to accidents. Fractures that had healed crooked, because no one had bothered to set them. His body had learned pain the way other children learned language. The coroner paused again at the hands. Clean nails. Carefully trimmed. No dirt underneath. That detail didn't belong. It suggested routine. Sunday habits. Someone who believed in order. Someone who could hurt a child and still insist on neatness. Evil with a calendar. His head had been shaved. Not cleanly. Patchy. Uneven. As if the person holding the clippers had been angry, or in a hurry, or both. There were no lice. No medical reason. Just absence. Control leaves marks even when it removes things. The boy's face was peaceful in a way that felt insulting. Mouth slightly open. Eyelashes resting softly on pale skin. If you ignored the bruises, ignored the damage, ignored everything that mattered, he could have been sleeping. That illusion made grown men uncomfortable. He looks like he's waiting, one technician muttered. Waiting for what? No one asked. Fingerprints were taken. Dental impressions recorded. Blood typed. Every modern tool pressed into service like a ritual meant to summon an identity from flesh alone. Nothing came back. No school records. No hospital files. No dental charts. No birth certificate that matched. It was as if the boy had been assembled out of spare parts and bad intentions, then erased from the paperwork that made people real. Someone suggested he might be from out of state. Another suggested he wasn't registered at all. A third said nothing, because he was thinking about the basement complaint from years earlier and how paperwork had a way of disappearing when it became inconvenient. The detective stared at the body longer than necessary. You couldn't look too long. That was dangerous. But you couldn't look away either. That felt worse. They photographed him from every angle. Front. Side. Back. Each click of the camera sounded like a small, mechanical apology. Later, those images would be printed, cropped, softened, and sent to newspapers. The public would see a version of him cleaned up for consumption. Even in death, he was edited. Someone asked what to call him in the files. There was a pause. Unknown male child, a clerk finally said, tapping her pencil. Her voice was neutral, professional. She had kids of her own. That night she would kiss them a little harder than usual and not know why. Unknown male child. It fit too easily. In the hallway, a detective leaned against the wall and rubbed his face. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He didn't want to go home, because home meant quiet, and quiet meant thinking. You know what gets me, he said to his partner. Not the killing. The after. The after. Yeah. Someone washed him. Someone clipped his nails. Someone put him in a clean blanket and a box that once held something meant to rock a baby to sleep. His partner exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. Maybe guilt. Maybe habit, the detective replied. Guilt implies a conscience. Black humor crept in where sanity threatened to leave. At least they recycled, someone else muttered, nodding toward the box. No one smiled. But the joke stayed in the room, sour and stubborn, because it was easier than screaming. The box itself became an object of obsession. Its flaps were folded neatly. No tearing. No panic. Whoever sealed it had time. Enough time to think. Enough time to change their mind. They didn't. Inside the cardboard, faint fibers were collected. Traces that hinted at a home, maybe a basement, maybe a place that smelled like old water and closed windows. Nothing specific enough to knock on a door. The boy gave them nothing. Not because he wanted to. Because everything had already been taken. By the time the body was moved to cold storage, the case had a nickname. The press loved it. The public remembered it. The detectives hated it. The boy in the box. As if the container mattered more than the child. As if the box was the mystery, not the life that ended inside it. One of the older detectives stood alone for a moment after everyone else left. He looked at the empty table, then at his reflection in the steel. You deserved better, he said quietly. The room did not answer. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that a boy without a name had just become a symbol, and that symbols, unlike children, were easy to abandon once they stopped being useful. The file was closed for the night. The questions were not. And somewhere beyond the morgue walls, the person who knew the boy's name was still breathing, still walking, still blending into the city that had already proven it could look straight at a child and see nothing at all. Chapter 5, America Tries to Care. By the third day, America remembered how to feel. It always did. On schedule. Right after breakfast and before dinner. Compassion squeezed neatly between advertisements for soap and automobiles. The boy in the box became a national story, and with it came the familiar performance of concern. Newspapers begged for recognition. Radio hosts lowered their voices. Ministers mentioned him in sermons, careful not to sound political. Someone lit a candle somewhere and felt better about themselves immediately. At the precinct, the phones surrendered. They rang with voices that trembled, cried, lied, and occasionally told the truth by accident. People wanted to help. Or be seen helping. Sometimes those were the same thing. A woman called from 3 states away, swearing the boy had been her neighbor's child, though she couldn't remember the neighbor's name. A truck driver said he'd seen a similar box behind a diner months earlier but couldn't remember which diner. Memory bent under the weight of attention. Psychics were the worst. They arrived in person, dressed like grief had a dress code. They held the boy's photograph between manicured fingers and closed their eyes dramatically, as if truth required theater. "I see water," one whispered. "I see pain." "Congratulations," someone thought. "You've cracked the case." Detectives nodded politely and wrote nothing down. Volunteers flooded in to distribute flyers. The boy's face stared out from lampposts and shop windows, grainy and pale, asking a question no one could answer. "Do you know me?" Most people looked away. Because recognition would have meant responsibility. The FBI joined the investigation with quiet confidence and louder paperwork. Files were opened, copied, shared. The machinery of justice whirred into motion, impressive and slightly hollow. Progress was measured in meetings. The boy did not attend them. One afternoon, a group of college students marched through downtown holding signs about protecting children. A photographer snapped a picture just as one of them laughed at something off camera. The headline praised their passion. The irony went unmentioned. In a diner near the precinct, detectives watched the coverage on a small television mounted in the corner. The sound was off, but the images were clear enough. "You ever notice," one of them said, stirring sugar into his coffee, "how loud caring gets when it's public?" Another took a bite of pie that tasted like nothing. "Yeah. And how quiet it gets when the cameras leave." They had received hundreds of tips by then. None of them fit. Each lead dissolved under scrutiny like cheap paper in rain. The boy remained a ghost wrapped in flesh. Someone suggested reopening old adoption records. Someone else suggested canvassing institutions. Someone quietly pointed out that many of those records no longer existed. Fires. Floods. Renovations. Administrative accidents. America had a remarkable way of losing inconvenient documents. A reporter asked a detective if he believed the case would ever be solved. The detective chose his words carefully, the way men do when they know they're being recorded. "We owe it to the child to try," he said. That sentence would be quoted for years. It did not bring the boy any closer to a name. Late at night, after the volunteers went home and the phones finally stopped ringing, the precinct felt emptier than before. The sudden absence of concern was louder than the noise had been. A young officer peeled a flyer off a bulletin board and folded it into his pocket without knowing why. Another detective stayed late, staring at a map dotted with pins that didn't connect to anything. America had tried to care. It had done so loudly, briefly, and on its own terms. And now, as attention drifted to the next headline, the boy was left exactly where he had started, alone in a file, known by an object, waiting for someone who didn't need an audience to remember him. Outside, a newspaper blew down the street, its headline already forgotten. Inside, the case grew colder. Not because people stopped caring. But because caring, it turned out, had an expiration date. Chapter 6, False Mothers and Borrowed Tears. They came in pairs, or alone, or with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Women sat across from detectives in small rooms that smelled like old paper and regret. They clutched purses too tightly. They cried at the right moments. Sometimes at the wrong ones. Grief has a rhythm, and trained eyes can hear when it's offbeat. "I think he was mine," one woman said, staring at the photograph as if it might blink first. "I lost him years ago." Years ago was a convenient distance. Close enough to feel real. Far enough to avoid details. She described a boy who loved toy trains and hated spinach. The detective nodded, patient, kind. He had learned that specifics were currency, and liars often spent too much of it too fast. Another woman arrived with a suitcase. She said she had come to take her son home. When told he was dead, she collapsed with a precision that suggested rehearsal. An ambulance was called. Later, it was discovered she had no children at all. Loneliness wears many disguises. Sometimes it wears a mother's face. Psychologists were consulted. Files were thickened with notes about hysteria, delusion, and unresolved loss. The city was full of women who had lost children in one way or another, to illness, to poverty, to institutions that promised help and delivered silence. Some of them needed the boy to be theirs. It gave the pain somewhere to land. One woman nearly convinced everyone. She arrived quietly. No suitcase. No drama. Her coat smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and cheap soap. Her voice was flat, controlled, as if emotion had been rationed long ago. She didn't cry when she saw the photograph. She just nodded. "That's him," she said. "Or close enough." That answer made the room colder. She spoke of an adopted boy. Of punishments meant to teach obedience. Of a basement where noise was not tolerated. Her story matched too many details to dismiss easily. The shaved head. The fear of water. The silence. Detectives exchanged glances. Hope is dangerous in investigations like this. It makes you careless. They asked for records. She said they were gone. They asked for names. She gave one. Then another. Each led to nothing. Addresses that no longer existed. Institutions that had closed. People who had died or conveniently forgotten. Still, something about her lingered. She knew how the boy had been carried. How light he felt near the end. How quiet. Details no newspaper had printed. When asked why she had waited so long to come forward, she looked at the wall behind the detective and smiled without warmth. "Because no one was asking," she said. Before charges could be considered, before paperwork could catch up to suspicion, she vanished. No forwarding address. No trace. As if the city itself had decided to protect her. Or erase her. The press barely noticed. A paragraph. Then nothing. In the precinct, frustration curdled into something heavier. The case board filled with crossed-out names and faded photographs. False mothers left behind borrowed tears and empty chairs. "You ever think," one detective said late one night, "that some people want to be guilty?" His partner didn't answer. Because the darker thought followed close behind. What if the real mother had never come? What if she had watched the headlines in silence, folded laundry, made dinner, and slept soundly, relieved that the boy no longer required explanations? Black humor crept back in, unwelcome but necessary. "At this rate," someone muttered, "we'll solve it by accident." No one laughed. The boy remained unnamed. Claimed and unclaimed. Passed between strangers like an emotional object. Each false confession added noise, not clarity. And somewhere in that noise, the truth sank deeper, weighed down by pity, performance, and the unbearable fact that sometimes people don't confess because they feel nothing at all. The room emptied again. The chair across from the detective stayed vacant. And the boy, who had been owned so many times in death, still belonged to no one who could answer for his life. Chapter 7: The Men Who Almost Spoke. He was not a suspect. That was the first mistake. His name appeared in the file the way accidents usually do, in the margin, written smaller than the rest, attached to a note that said possible information. Not guilt. Not involvement. Just information. As if knowledge were harmless on its own. He lived alone in a narrow row house that smelled of boiled cabbage and old newspapers. The kind of place where clocks ticked loudly because there was nothing else competing for attention. His neighbors described him as quiet, polite, forgettable. A man who nodded instead of waving. A man who listened more than he spoke. Those men are dangerous in investigations. Because they notice things. A detective knocked on his door one evening just as the streetlights flickered on. The man opened it halfway, chain still on, eyes already tired. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said. That sentence bought him another hour of life. Inside, the house was meticulously clean in a way that suggested control rather than comfort. Ashtrays were empty but stained. A radio murmured softly in the background, tuned to a station that played nothing current. The man offered coffee he did not drink himself. He knew about the boy. Too much. He spoke in fragments at first. A neighbor. A child he used to see. A basement light that stayed on at odd hours. Crying that stopped suddenly one winter. "Kids cry," he said, shrugging. "Until they don't." The detective leaned forward, careful not to rush him. Truth, when cornered, sometimes bolts. "You ever report it?" the detective asked. The man smiled, thin and apologetic. "I thought about it." Thought about it. That phrase did a lot of damage in the city. He said he had seen a box being carried once. Not into the woods. Into a car. Wrapped. Careful. He couldn't remember the license plate. Of course he couldn't. Memory protects cowards first. But he remembered the weight. "It wasn't heavy," he said quietly. "That's what bothered me." He started smoking again while he talked. Hands shaking now. Ash falling where it shouldn't. The radio hissed between stations like it was listening. The detective asked him to come down to the precinct the next day. Formal statement. Just to get it on record. The man agreed too quickly. That was the second mistake. He spent the night drinking cheap whiskey and staring at the walls. At some point he wrote something down on a scrap of paper. Names. Or maybe just words that felt safer on paper than in his head. He never brought it with him. In the morning, a neighbor heard the radio playing too loudly and knocked on the door. When no one answered, she called it in. By the time the ambulance arrived, the man was already cold. Heart attack, they said. Stress. Pre-existing conditions. A death so ordinary it barely slowed the paperwork. The irony was almost elegant. The detective stood in the doorway, looking at the overturned chair, the spilled ashtray, the radio still humming. "So that's that," an officer said. But it wasn't. Because the man had known something. Not enough to solve the case. Just enough to make it real. Enough to make himself dangerous to someone, or to his own conscience. People die with secrets every day. Most of them don't matter. This one did. The file was updated. A line added. Potential witness deceased. As if that explained anything. Later, in a bar that smelled like bleach and regret, the detective stared into his glass and said, "You know what kills me?" His partner looked up. He didn't die because he knew too much. He died because he knew just enough. They drank to that. Not in tribute. In exhaustion. The man was buried quietly. No one mentioned the boy at the service. It didn't feel appropriate. Death prefers not to compete. And with him went a piece of the truth, not the whole thing, never that, but a fragment sharp enough to cut if it had been handled differently. The case did not collapse. It sagged. Like a structure that realizes too late it has been built on missing beams. Somewhere between that man's last cigarette and the closing of his front door, the investigation crossed an invisible line, from difficult to doomed. No one announced it. They just kept working, pretending the silence hadn't gotten heavier. And the boy, who had already lost everything else, lost one more chance at being remembered by someone brave enough to speak while it still mattered. Chapter 8, The System That Failed Quietly. Failure did not arrive with a crash. It came in envelopes. Thick ones at first, full of forms and optimism. Then thinner. Then not at all. The case didn't end. It simply stopped moving, like a body left too long in cold water. Meetings became shorter. Faces around the table changed. Detectives were reassigned. Promotions happened. Retirements happened. The boy in the box stayed exactly where he was, pinned to corkboard, reduced to shorthand, filed under unsolved. The box itself went missing for a while. Not stolen. Misplaced. That was the word they used. As if cardboard could wander off on its own. As if evidence ever disappeared without permission. When it resurfaced, it smelled faintly of dust and time. Too much time. The fibers collected from inside it were re-examined, then refiled, then quietly deprioritized. Technology had limits. Budgets had limits. Patience had limits too, especially when there were fresh crimes demanding attention. The system did not collapse under the weight of the boy's death. It shrugged. A young detective tried to revive the case, fresh eyes, fresh anger. He stayed late, traced old addresses, knocked on doors that no longer belonged to the same people. He believed persistence was a virtue. The city taught him otherwise. Institutions that might have held answers had been renamed, reorganized, or wiped clean by fires no one could quite remember. Records were lost in transition. Staff members smiled apologetically and offered coffee instead of cooperation. At the time, one administrator said, "We did the best we could." At the time. That phrase aged beautifully. It excused everything. The detective noticed something unsettling as he dug deeper. No single failure had doomed the case. No villainous clerk had shredded the wrong file. No dramatic conspiracy had sealed the boy's fate. It was smaller than that. A missed follow-up here. A delayed report there. A decision to handle something tomorrow that quietly turned into never. Each choice reasonable on its own. Together, catastrophic. The system hadn't been cruel. It had been tired. Black humor surfaced in break rooms and hallways. Maybe the kid didn't exist, someone joked once. That'd explain the paperwork. The laugh that followed was thin and uncomfortable, like ice over shallow water. Years passed. New crimes came with louder screams, clearer villains, better narratives. The boy in the box had none of those things. He had no advocate who could shout louder than the noise of the city. Even his grave was temporary at first. Unmarked. Efficient. Anonymous. The way the system preferred its failures, quiet and out of sight. One retired officer admitted years later that the case haunted him. Not because of what had been done to the boy, but because of how easily everyone had learned to live with not knowing. "We didn't give up," he said. "We just stopped." That distinction mattered to him. It didn't matter to the boy. The file grew yellow. The ink faded. The photographs curled at the edges like they were trying to look away. And somewhere, the person, or people, responsible aged. They got sick. They laughed at jokes. They voted. They blended in perfectly with a society that had already proven it could forget a child without even meaning to. The system failed the way most systems do. Quietly. Politely. With paperwork filed in the right place. And when the last original detective closed the file for the final time, he did so gently, as if not to wake the truth sleeping inside. It never did. Because sometimes justice doesn't die. It just gets very, very tired. Chapter 9, The Woman in the Shadows. The story refused to stay buried. Decades passed, and the case became a rumor with footnotes. A lesson taught in police academies. A trivia question for people who confused curiosity with care. The boy in the box aged strangely, never older, never younger, frozen in that grainy photograph while the world learned new ways to forget old sins. Then, years later, a woman spoke. Not loudly. Not to cameras. Not even with confidence. She spoke because she was dying. Her statement did not arrive like a confession. It arrived like an inventory. Calm. Precise. Devoid of drama. The kind of truth that doesn't ask to be believed, it just sits there, heavy and inconvenient. She described a boy. Bought, not adopted. Acquired the way one acquires furniture when money and patience are low. She spoke of a house that looked respectable from the outside. Neighbors who waved. Curtains that stayed drawn. Inside, the rules were simple. Silence was rewarded. Noise was punished. She spoke of baths that were not meant for cleaning. Of food withheld not out of poverty, but discipline. Of a child trained to understand that pain was the cost of existing. The details were wrong in all the right ways. Not theatrical. Not rehearsed. Just specific enough to make the air in the room change. She mentioned the shaved head. She mentioned the fear of water. She mentioned the box. The men listening to her had heard 1,000 lies in their careers. This did not sound like one of them. Lies try to protect something. This story did not. It condemned everyone. She said the boy died after an accident. That word again. Accident. As if cruelty ever tripped and fell by mistake. As if prolonged suffering could be reduced to bad timing. She described panic. Cleanup. Decisions made not in rage, but calculation. The body washed. The nails clipped. The box folded. Order restored. She said she didn't go to the police because she didn't trust them. She said she didn't tell anyone because no one had ever listened before. She said she lived with it every day, which sounded less like remorse and more like a life sentence she had learned to decorate. When asked for proof, she had none. No documents. No witnesses. No surviving records. Just memory. And memory, inconveniently, was not admissible. The detectives wanted her to be wrong. Because if she was right, then the case hadn't failed because of complexity or chance. It had failed because the truth arrived too late, spoken by someone already halfway out of the world. She died shortly after giving her statement. No charges were filed. Officially, her account remained unconfirmed. Unsubstantiated. Another shadow cast over an already dark story. The kind of truth the system files under interesting but unusable. But privately, among those who had seen the records, who had read the old reports, who remembered the shaved head and the clean nails, something shifted. The story fit. Too well. Black humor crept in again, softer now. So, someone said quietly, the mystery was solved after the statute of limitations expired on justice. No one corrected him. The public never received closure. Just speculation. Arguments. Online forums filled with certainty and rage from people safely removed from consequence. The boy received nothing at all. No apology could reach him. No verdict could change what had been done. Even if her story was true, and many believed it was, it arrived stripped of power. Truth without teeth. The woman in the shadows had spoken. And the world had answered the way it always did when the truth showed up late to its own crime scene. With a shrug. And silence. Chapter 10, A Grave with a Name That Isn't His. Names are usually the first thing we give to the living. For the boy, it was one of the last. Years after the box, after the headlines had yellowed and the detectives had aged into ghosts of themselves, a decision was made. Quiet. Administrative. Almost kind. The boy would no longer be buried as unknown. He would be given a name. Not his name. No one had that. But something close enough to ease the discomfort of visiting a grave that belonged to an object instead of a person. They chose something gentle. Something neutral. A compromise between dignity and ignorance. The ceremony was small. A few officials. A few strangers who had followed the case like one follows a scar, with fascination and discomfort. Someone brought flowers. Someone else took a photograph, then felt ashamed and took it anyway. The stone was clean. The lettering precise. It promised remembrance without delivering answers. Here lies a child. Known only to God. That line did a lot of work. It suggested closure. It implied care. It shifted responsibility upward, away from institutions and hands that could be named. A detective who had once worked the case stood a few steps back, hat in hand. His hair was thinner now. His anger, blunter. He stared at the grave and tried to feel relief. He didn't. Because a name given in death does not reach backward. It does not rewrite nights spent hungry or mornings spent afraid. It does not travel through time and knock on basement doors. It just sits there. Polite. Decorative. The grave became a destination. People visited. They left toys. Stuffed animals with stitched smiles that felt inappropriate in their optimism. Notes promising never to forget him, written by people who had not known him at all. Grief loves symbols. They're easier than accountability. Children who walked past the grave asked questions. Parents answered carefully, editing the truth the way it had always been edited for this boy. Too much honesty made people uncomfortable. He's at peace now, someone said. Peace was never part of his story. The name on the stone did not match any record. It closed no case. It solved nothing. But it allowed the living to exhale, to believe something had been finished. The system prefers rituals to reckoning. The box was returned to storage. The files were archived. The case was labeled cold in a way that suggested temperature rather than abandonment. And yet, something lingered. Because naming the boy had not made the story smaller. It had made it heavier. It forced an uncomfortable truth into the open, that everyone involved had known, at some level, that the answers were gone. Not hidden. Gone. The grave stood as a compromise between memory and failure. A place where people could stand and feel sad without feeling responsible. The boy remained exactly what he had always been, a life defined by the things that never arrived in time. Help. Safety. A name spoken with love. The stone did not change that. It just made the absence official. Chapter 11, What Remains Unsaid. Time did what it always does when justice stalls. It normalized the absence. The case became a reference point rather than a wound. A sentence that began with remember when instead of what do we do now. New detectives learned it as history. Old ones learned to stop bringing it up. Silence settled in layers. There were still questions, of course. There always are. But questions without answers eventually start to feel rude, like guests who stay too long after the conversation has ended. What remained unsaid mattered more than anything written in the files. No one officially admitted that the system had been unprepared to protect a child without a paper trail. No one apologized for the missed reports, the delayed follow-ups, the quiet decisions that added up to erasure. Institutions don't apologize easily. Apologies imply memory. Memory implies guilt. So instead, there was language. Unfortunate. Complex. A product of its time. Those phrases softened the edges just enough to make them livable. In interviews years later, officials spoke carefully, hands folded, voices steady. They described a different era. Fewer resources. Less awareness. They meant well. They always did. What they didn't say was this: the boy had not been invisible. He had been inconvenient. Someone had heard him cry. Someone had noticed the bruises. Someone had chosen not to ask again. The truth had not vanished, it had been ignored, repeatedly, until it learned to stay quiet. Black humor returned one last time, thinner now, almost gentle. At least he made history, a retired officer said once. Most kids like him don't even get that. No one laughed. But no one argued either. The story lived on in documentaries, articles, late-night conversations fueled by coffee and unease. People debated suspects with confidence born of distance. They demanded justice from the safety of decades later. None of it reached the boy. He existed now only as an idea, a warning, a symbol, a reminder people pointed to when they wanted to talk about protecting children without asking what that actually required. What remained unsaid was the simplest truth of all. He had not needed a task force. He had needed one person to care loudly enough, early enough, when it still mattered. That failure did not belong to one monster, one woman in the shadows, one cowardly witness. It belonged to everyone who had found silence easier than responsibility. The files stayed closed. The conversations moved on. And the space where answers should have been remained empty, not because it couldn't be filled, but because no one alive was willing to carry what filling it would mean. That was the real legacy of the boy. Not mystery. Not tragedy. But the uncomfortable knowledge that some truths don't disappear. They are simply left behind, waiting for someone brave enough to admit they were always there. Chapter 12, The box is still open. the box was never really closed. Cardboard doesn't seal things the way people want it to. It bends. It absorbs. It remembers. Long after the flaps were folded and the evidence tags were tied, the idea of that box stayed open, in records, in conversations, in the uncomfortable pause that follows when someone asks what happened and no one knows how to finish the sentence. The boy in the box did not get justice. He got chronology. He got theory stacked neatly where answers should have been. He got documentaries, podcasts, and arguments between strangers who would never have had to decide whether to look away when a child cried in the dark. Sometimes people ask why the case still matters. They expect an answer about history. About forensics. About how far investigative science has come. Those answers are safe. They keep the story academic. The real answer is simpler and harder to sit with. The case matters because nothing about it is extraordinary. No genius criminal. No elaborate cover-up. No master plan. Just ordinary people making ordinary choices that leaned, slowly and consistently, toward cruelty or indifference. The boy did not vanish. He was misplaced by a system that mistook silence for order. Somewhere, in the years after the woods and the rain and the box, lives continued. The people who knew something aged, softened, justified themselves, or carried their secrets quietly to the grave. The city learned to live with the unanswered question the way cities always do, by building over it. New houses. New roads. New children. Sometimes, on quiet nights, a few of the old detectives still thought about him. Not as a case. As a weight. They wondered if they could have pushed harder, asked differently, cared longer. Those thoughts never led anywhere useful. Regret rarely does. The grave remains. The name remains. The truth does not. And maybe that is the final cruelty of the story. Not that a child died unseen. But that the world proved it could absorb that fact, adjust, and move on without breaking. The box is still open. Not in the woods. In memory. In the space where answers should live. In every moment when someone hears something wrong and decides it isn't their problem. Sometimes the truth doesn't vanish. Sometimes it simply waits, patient and intact, while everyone else learns how to live without it. And that, more than any unsolved mystery, is the part that should keep you awake. The end.